Welcome to another Friday afternoon live stream. It's a pleasure to have you here. You may notice that I'm in a different set than I have been for the last 3 or 4. And that's because the crew here are also filming or videoing something called Girl Talk. Now, I don't know that much about it. All I can say is the people who are doing it are terrific. And if you keep an eye on this channel on YWAM Harpenden, I think it's a very interesting conversation between 3 or 4 of our young ladies here. Also, I want to remind you, this is me talking. This is not YWAM talking. And this is available on my blog, lynngreen.net or org. And it's also available on YWAM Harpenden and on my Facebook. So I hope not only will you enjoy watching this and may be thoughtful and provoking, but also it would be great if you'd share that, because I notice that we've been getting more and more viewers, but part of that's because people share it. So please do. I was wondering what to do today on, and repeatedly this week, my attention has been captured by the subject of forgiveness. And the power of forgiveness has just come back to me again and again through different means. We are praying every morning from Monday to Friday, 9 a.m. to 10 a.m. outside because of COVID restrictions. And even though it's coming towards November, we're still meeting outside. And they've been really, every time is different. And there are 40 to 50 people gathered out of our community here. And one of those times earlier this week was on forgiveness. And it was quite profound. And people just expressing forgiveness, or also how they sometimes have asked for forgiveness and been forgiven, and the release, or asked forgiveness and not been forgiven, and the pain of that. And so I've been thinking more about the power of forgiveness. Because I was involved with the reconciliation walk and getting that underway, however long ago that was now, over 20 years ago, I studied forgiveness quite a lot, and I found it a fascinating subject, just spiritually, psychologically, socially. Forgiveness, what a powerful thing. Well, one of the things that captured my attention this week was an article on the BBC website, and that website has, towards the bottom of it, it has a number of little small pictures and then a description beside it, and they're called longer reads. And there was one about a young lady by the name of Candice Mama from Soweto, the sometimes infamous township just outside Johannesburg in South Africa. And I read through that, and it really touched me again deeply. So I thought today I'd like to focus on that story a bit, and then expand some on why forgiveness is difficult, and what we can do to make it easier, or make it at least attainable. So to Candice Mama, she discovered as she grew a little older that her father had been killed when she was only 8 months old. So there was a sense of absence in her life, and she picked that up from her mother, but didn't know much about it. And as she grew up, she was very curious about her father. And her father had been an anti-apartheid activist. And she began to hear from others, and when she got old enough, she read a little bit in a book of clippings of her father, that he was an extraordinary character who was joyful and larger than life, and was one of those people who, even though he would have been seen as being systemically disadvantaged, wrote in one of his articles, "There's no reason why I as a black person cannot achieve a lot in my life." So he had a positive attitude, and that infected her up until the point when she was 9 years old. And there had been visitors to her home quite a lot because of her father and then her mother holding the story. And sometimes when visitors came to ask about her father, her mother would say, "Could you get that book off the shelf?" And she would take this book down and give it to them. And then there was weeping and wailing at times. And she of course, very curious about what was in that book. So one day when she was 9 years old and there was no one else there, she did what she was not supposed to do. Her mother said, "Don't open that book." But she opened the book and she saw the picture she was not supposed to see, which was a picture of her father's burnt body, still gripping the steering wheel of the car where he had been shot, and then where an infamous man who became known by the nickname Pure Evil, a man by the name of Eugene Koch, had shot him, ambushed him, and the others in the car because he was known as a really effective activist, and they were wanting to get rid of those guys. Shot him, and then came to the window, he was still alive, and emptied the magazine of his automatic rifle into her father's body, then set the car on fire and burned it out. And she couldn't imagine anybody being that evil. But what happened when she read that was a deep sense of loss and resentment was planted within her. And that resentment began to grow. And until at the age of 16, she was admitted into hospital with an apparent heart attack. And they did a lot of tests on her and they medicated her and so on, but the next day, the doctor who had seen her on her entrance and admission to the hospital came to her and said, you haven't had a heart attack, but what you have is levels of stress that I've never seen in a person your age. Let me quote, "I've never seen stress symptoms so severe in someone your age. I don't know how to tell you this, but your body is killing you. And if you don't change something, then you're certainly going to pass away soon." That was the quote. A couple more years went on. She tried to change, but she was still a very anxious, uptight person with a lot of different illnesses, ulcers and so on. And then after Mandela became president, and I would imagine most of you watching this know about Mandela's presidency. He was imprisoned on an island for, I think it was 27 years, because he was the best known of all the activists trying to undermine the apartheid systemic racism at the time. And the thing about Mandela, which was so amazing, is he refused to ever become bitter. He continued to be forgiving and gracious towards his prison guards. And when he was finally released, some of the prison guards wrote their own accounts of who Mandela was. And of course, he then, because of his forgiveness and his magnanimous spirit, this bigness of heart that Nelson Mandela had, he became an example to the whole nation, and they transitioned from systemic racism and systemic elitism for white people through to majority rule with minimal violence when everybody was sure, I remember the days well, that they were headed for massive bloodshed. Now, South Africa's in trouble again today, and I've just been thinking recently, where is the Mandela for today? Where are those who say, like Martin Luther King did, the day is coming, I have a dream, where men and women are known by their character, not by the color of their skin. Mandela was one of those. And he cooperated with others, including Archbishop Desmond Tutu, to develop the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And that was a especially powerful move that, if you haven't read about that or heard about that, it's really worth looking into, because they realized that the pain of those years would never be moderated without people forgiving, and you can't forgive really and fully until the truth is known, and then the opportunity for people to be reconciled. So the Mandela influence began to impact her some, but she writes in her book, before long she concluded that she needed to do what for some would be the unthinkable. She had to forgive the man who had taken her father away. This is a quote from her. "It started as a revenge in some ways, Because I thought to myself, every time I think of this man, it's like he controls me too. I get these panic attacks. It's like I'm not in control of my emotions. It was like for me, no, he already killed my father, and now he's killing me too. So for me, forgiveness wasn't so much something I could just think about doing. It was something that was crucial for me to survive. So she's still a teenager at this time, and she decided, now here's something that I think is pretty rare, but it's a really important step. She decided, I have to take control of my emotions. And you know, we don't directly control our emotions, but we do indirectly control our emotions by controlling what we can control, which is what we think about and talk about and focus on. It's hard to do, but it can be done. So she quotes, I quote her, "When I decided to remove the emotional attachment that I held towards Eugene Koch, was his name, pure evil, and the incident that had occurred, I started to realize that, okay, I'm forgiving this person. And that's what forgiveness became to me. Not having an emotional response to the trauma." There's a lot of insight into that. For a teenager, you know, a girl coping with all the pressure. She found this hugely liberating. And again, I quote, "I was like, whoa." See, that's a quote. "I can feel light. I can feel joy. I can be happy." And those were things I'd never even entertained at some point in my life. And the irony is, until I got to a point where I forgave Eugene, I actually didn't think I needed those things. And so the story goes on that with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, they had, the opportunity was given to the relatives of victims to meet the perpetrators of the murders and the injustices. And so she and her wider family had the opportunity to meet pure evil. And she describes how when they went into the prison, because he had been sentenced to prison, life imprisonment, although later paroled, and they lobbied for that, her family. She said it was amazing because it was like nothing had changed over the years. He looked the same as the pictures she'd seen of the man who was on trial for murdering her father. And she expected to have an evil aura about him, but she said that wasn't so. She didn't feel at all afraid. In fact, when she and her family were introduced to this pure evil, Eugene Koch, he bowed slightly every time he met someone and said in a quiet voice, "It's a pleasure to meet you. It's a pleasure to meet you. It's a pleasure to meet you." It was disarming for her. So again, from her book, I said, "Eugene, I want to forgive you." That was when it came to her turn. "But before I do, I want to know one thing." And he said, "Sure. What's that?" I said, "Do you forgive yourself?" She writes, "He was noticeably taken aback for the first time in the whole encounter. And he said, 'Every time a family comes in here, I think that's the one question I pray they never ask me.'" He looked down and away, and he dabbed the side of his eye because a tear had run down. And he looked back and said, "When you've done the things I've done, how do you ever forgive yourself?" Candace started crying at that point, not for herself or her father, but she says because she realized that de Koch would never know peace himself. She says again, quote, we were two people that were broken, sitting in front of each other, and so it was a very transformative moment. She says at the end of the meeting, Candace stood up first, walked over to Eugene, and asked if she could hug him. And she says, he stumbled up to his feet, and he held me in an embrace, and he said, "I am so sorry for what I've done, and your father would have been so proud of the woman you've become." That whole reconciliation process was sufficiently transformative to Eugene de Koch, that he ended up being paroled early because the families wanted him paroled, because he knew where a lot of the bodies had been buried, the bodies of the people that he, and it was actually a police unit that became known as the killing squad, or the pure evil squad. And he knew where a lot of the bodies had been put. And so one of the reasons he was paroled is the family saying, look, there's no point in punishing him. He's punishing himself enough. Let him at least do the kindness of pointing out where the bodies are, so that the families of the victims can have that measure of closure. So Candace says in her book, Forgiveness Redefined, you can experience incredible trauma, and it's not your fault. And a lot of people say, well, why is it on me, the victim of the trauma, to do the forgiving? I didn't do anything wrong. But she says, I would say to that, every time you give that incident or that person power, you are inflicting more damage on yourself. So you are re-traumatizing yourself, and in many ways, you are giving that person continued power over your life. That's a real psychological insight. I read somewhere else this week, because I've been interested in the subject, that Freud only addressed, Freud, the breakthrough psychologist, only addressed the issue of forgiveness 3 times. He only mentioned it 3 times, and that was always in the context of a religion. But since then, scholars have studied it more and more, and there have been more and more academic inquiries into the dynamics of forgiveness. One of those is one that I read back when I was doing the Reconciliation Walk, and it's by Robert Enright and Joanna North, and it's called Exploring Forgiveness. And they are both professors at the University of Wisconsin, and Archbishop Desmond Tutu wrote the foreword to this. Really interesting material on the psychological processes and effects of forgiveness. But it starts off with another one of those stories, a bit like Candace Mama, but different in that Marietta Yeager is the woman who features primarily in the first chapter of this. The rest of it's pretty academic, but the first chapter is the story of a woman, a family, but it's told through her eyes, with a lovely daughter of 5 years old who's kidnapped out of a tent when they're on a family outing before school starts, and ends up being raped and murdered. It's really hard to even say that. Probably impossible to imagine a worst case scenario than that. And I think that's why William Paul Young, when he wrote The Shack, had that kind of story as a central narrative. And I know a lot of people haven't watched The Shack because they heard it's about that and think, I just can't watch that. And there are bits of it that are hard to watch. But he had to write it that way because you have to think through the most difficult traumas, the most seemingly impossible things to forgive, and explore whether or not there is even the possibility of forgiving the perpetrators of such horrific crimes. And that's what The Shack is about. And I still highly recommend that. And I really recommend, after you've seen The Shack or read the book, then watch the series of 20, but they are fascinating. They pull you in every time you watch one. 20 short videos called Restoring the Shack that Paul Young did, and I think they're just available on YouTube now, which provoke you to discuss the themes behind The Shack. And he's such a good storyteller that it's really a very interesting watch. And because it continues to explore the subject of forgiveness, it can be really beneficial to anybody who's struggling with bitterness and resentment against anyone. So I do recommend that. But this whole subject, to me, provokes the central question. If forgiveness is such an obvious thing, and remember, Jesus said this in Matthew 6, if you forgive other people when they sin against you, your heavenly Father will also forgive you. I mean, what more motivation can we have? Because the implication is if you want forgiveness, you have to forgive. You can't expect to be forgiven if you're holding resentment against someone else. So we're highly motivated, and yet it's still so difficult. Why is that? Well, I think it's this. I think this is the core issue. Every single one of us has a highly developed sense of what's fair, justice. We recognize injustice when we see it. And when we feel we're the victims of injustice, it's really hard. Sometimes it's equally hard when we adopt the sense of injustice that someone else has had. We see their story, we hear their story, we live their story with them, and we pick up their hurts and their offenses. And when we have taken a sense of injustice into ourselves, that we've been treated unfairly, we have been hurt, we've been damaged, or someone else we love or respect has been, it seems that by holding the resentment, we are visiting some kind of vengeance or getting even or somehow compensating for what that person has done. We're punishing them by refusing to forgive. But someone here on the morning that we had an emphasis on forgiveness in our morning prayer times spoke up and said, I once heard somebody say, and it proved to be true for me, that unforgiveness, resentment, is like drinking poison in the hopes that the person who hurt you will die. And that's really well said, really well said. Because as long as we are trying to somehow punish that person through withholding forgiveness, we're the ones being damaged. And the damage can get deeper and deeper, as it did in the story of Candace's mama. To forgive feels like an injustice. That's why it's so hard. To forgive feels like we're letting someone off scot-free. We are saying, it doesn't matter to me anymore. And that's really hard to say. And yet, it's vital for our freedom, because actually our failure to forgive, or our unwillingness to forgive, rarely does any significant damage to the other person, but it damages us very, very deeply. I've experienced it some myself. There was a time, I don't think I've ever said this in a way that is recorded, and I hesitated, but still, I feel I should tell this on the record. There was a time when I was in a leadership meeting, probably 60, 70 of us there, a lot of the leaders of YWAM at the time. I think it was in the 90s, so maybe just after the turn of the century. And I was pushing for some information to be shared publicly, and I was pushing someone else who was a senior YWAM leader, and Lauren Cunningham, in my view, came to their defense and actually said a few things that questioned my loyalty to that person and the situation. And that made me angry. You know, we'll respond differently when we feel that we've been treated unjustly. I felt that I had been publicly, indirectly, but definitely criticized for not having good character. And my response was anger. And some people feel hurt. You know, it just depends on your personality. But I nursed that anger. I talked about, you know, for people close to me, I talked about that anger. And when I talked to my wife within a few days, she responded, "Lynn, you got to put that right." I said, I can't put it right without being face to face, and I'm not going to fly to the other side of the world to have a short conversation about this. What I was really saying is, I don't want to. But what I said is that, well, if I get an opportunity, I will. And for 2 years, I nursed that resentment against Lauren. And for 2 years, looking back on it, I would say I sowed dissension into all that I was responsible for in YWAM. At the time, I was director of YWAM Europe, Middle East, and Africa. And we just, looking back, I sowed dissension and disintegration all over. And it was years before all of the division and conflicts between leaders was sorted out. But at the end of a couple of years, I had what I had said I would do, which was an opportunity that I found. Lauren was in my living room here in Harpenden, Highfield Oval in England, and we were sitting talking to one another, just with a coffee table in between us, and there was the opportunity. I still didn't want to do it because somehow I wanted to keep nursing the resentment. And I was afraid to risk the relationship further. And I'm sure some of you can identify with that. I'm sure some of you can, but back when we were, and I described where we were, and I said, I brought up this subject and you responded by that, and that really upset me. And when I had shared that, his eyes began to well up with tears a bit, and he said, I don't remember that, but I'm really, really sorry. And he slid off the couch that he was sitting on, and he slid to his knees, and he crawled a little way toward me. I was only about 2 meters away. And on his knees, he said, will you forgive me, with tears? And I felt like such a fool, having nursed that resentment against a man of such humility and softness of heart. And of course I forgave him, and I asked for his forgiveness for carrying that resentment, and we were reconciled, and we've not had any difficulties ever since. But it illustrated to me the damage that unforgiveness does in our lives. And yet it was such a minor little offense, The damage that unforgiveness does is not directly related to how serious the offense is. It's related to our response to it. So I did a lot of damage because of a very poor response to a minor offense. That's why I have such a high regard for the likes of Candace Mama, or the likes of Marietta Yeager, or the likes of the primary characters in The Shack. People who find a way to forgive the deepest offenses. Now, this is the third in what is a little series. I didn't plan this as a part of the series. Started with spiritual abuse and then went on to accountability and YWAM, and now forgiveness. I'm really not trying to put things back on people who have been on the receiving end of what they consider to be spiritual abuse. I'm not doing that at all. And I want to say this: if you feel you were unjustly treated or unfairly treated at any time in Youth with a Mission, we're not trying to duck that. But it's not the organization that's damaged you. It's somebody. And that's not to deny any responsibility or anything else. It's just that people damage people. And you'll never change the whole institution by shouting insults at all of YWAM. I'm sorry if this sounds harsh, but it's just realistic. There's no harshness in my heart about this at all. These things are personal, and they have to be dealt with personally. And it starts with forgiveness, because when you can forgive in your own heart, then you've changed your world. And when you change your world, you have the opportunity and the strength to be able to change more of the world around you. And I know for sure that when people come to me with a gentle spirit and having forgiven, and they have something really hard to say to me that needs to be changed, it's much easier for me to receive it than when somebody comes at me effectively shouting and blaming and casting the whole situation as if one party is entirely innocent and the other party is entirely guilty, or a whole group of people are entirely guilty, because life's not that way. We all have guilt. We all are responsible. We all have to own our own reactions. And when we own our own reactions, then we can set about doing our best to put other relationships right. And you know, if we were all doing that, then whole movements would change, whole nations would change. We would see a revolution over time, and that's been done before. I think of the Great Awakening. I think of the Second Great Awakening. I think of the whole Wilberforce and Clapham sect movement here in the United Kingdom around 1800 to 1830. But it's because of a lot of individuals having heart changes and dealing with their issues, then dealing with their relationships, and on from there. And it all starts with the power of forgiveness. So let me finish by just saying, if you're struggling, as I have done at times, remember Candace's mama. Remember Marietta Yeager and her story, which is available in different places, not just in this book. But most of all, remember Jesus. Because no one ever even came close to being treated as unfairly, with such deep injustices and such unbearable woundings as Jesus. But he was the one who, as he was dying from the wounds inflicted by the men who were still taunting him and mocking him, he was the one who said, "Father, forgive them. They don't understand what they're doing." Grasp the power of forgiveness. It's absolutely wonderful. Thank you.